White judge finds black woman, only to learn she's a private investigator. Part 1. The morning sun pushed through the tall windows of courtroom 3. Judge Edward Wilson adjusted his black robe and looked at the clock. 9 o'clock sharp. Time to begin another day of traffic court. Next case, he called, his voice firm but tired. Grace Brown stepped forward. She wore a neat blue blazer and carried a small notepad. Her dark skin contrasted with the mostly white faces in the courtroom. Judge Wilson had been on the bench for 20 years in the small town of Westfield. He rarely saw new faces, especially not in his traffic court. Grace Brown, he read from the file. 6 parking violations near Memorial Hospital in the past month. He looked up at her over his reading glasses. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor, Grace said. Her voice was calm and clear. The judge frowned. He had seen the photos in the file. Her car was clearly parked in the emergency zone on 6 different days. Ms. Brown, the evidence seems quite clear. Your car was photographed in a no parking zone 6 times. I understand how it looks, sir, Grace replied. Do you have an explanation? Judge Wilson asked. The court was quiet. People were listening closely. Grace opened her mouth to speak, but the judge cut her off. Actually, it doesn't matter. The law is very clear about emergency zones. They must remain clear at all times. He tapped his pen on the desk. The fine is $300. A small flash of disappointment crossed Grace's face, but she quickly hid it. Judge Wilson had expected anger or argument. Most people argued. But Grace simply nodded and reached for her wallet. Pay the clerk on your way out, he said, already looking at the next file. As Grace turned to leave, she placed a small white card on the edge of his desk. The judge barely noticed it as he called the next case. The day continued with its usual parade of traffic violations, minor disputes, and small claims. By 5 o'clock, Judge Wilson was tired and ready to go home. As he gathered his papers, his fingers brushed against the card Grace had left. Grace Brown, private investigator. It read in simple black letters. Below was an address just 2 streets away from Memorial Hospital. Judge Wilson sat back in his chair. A private investigator? That was unexpected. Why would she be parked at the hospital so often? And why didn't she explain herself in court? That night, at home, Edward couldn't stop thinking about the case. His wife, Jane, noticed his quiet mood during dinner. Tough day? She asked as she cleared the plates. Not really, he said. Just a strange case. A woman with multiple parking tickets didn't defend herself, even though I think she could have. Maybe she had her reasons, Jane suggested. The next morning, instead of driving straight to the courthouse, Edward drove past Memorial Hospital. He noticed the parking spots where Grace had received her tickets. They all had a clear view of the hospital's back entrance and loading dock. On impulse, he parked his car and walked to the address on Grace's card. It was a small office building. Suite 214 had a simple sign. Brown Investigations. He knocked on the door. Come in, called a familiar voice. Grace looked up from her desk, surprise briefly showing on her face when she saw who her visitor was. Judge Wilson, she said, standing quickly. Ms. Brown, he nodded. I found your card. Interesting. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. Please, sit down. The office was small but neat. On one wall hung framed certificates, a criminal justice degree and a private investigator's license. On another wall was a large map of the hospital and surrounding streets, with several areas marked in red. I'm guessing those parking tickets weren't just bad luck, Judge Wilson said, nodding toward the map. Grace studied him for a moment, as if deciding how much to share. No, they weren't, she finally said. I'm working on a case. Medical supplies are being stolen from the hospital. Those parking spots give me the best view of the loading dock where I believe the thefts are happening. Why? Didn't you explain this in court? He asked. Because, Grace said quietly, the people stealing the supplies might be in positions of power at the hospital. I couldn't risk them finding out about my investigation. Judge Wilson felt something shift inside him. He had judged her without knowing her story. Had he been fair? Had he been right? So you accepted the fine rather than compromise your case? Sometimes justice has a price, Grace said simply. The end. Part 2. Judge Wilson sat quietly in Grace's office. The map on her wall showed weeks of careful work. Red marks showed where she had watched the hospital. Notes and times were written in neat handwriting. This was not a simple case. "Tell me more about these thefts," he said. Grace pulled out a folder. "It started 6 months ago. Medical supplies began to go missing. Small things at first, bandages, medicines, gloves. Then bigger items, equipment worth thousands of pounds. And the hospital knows about this?" "They do," Grace nodded. "But they think it's just paperwork errors or staff taking supplies home by mistake. I know it's more than that." "How can you be so sure?" Judge Wilson asked. Grace's eyes hardened. "Because patients are being charged for supplies they never received. My mother was one of them." Now Judge Wilson understood her determination. This was personal. She was in memorial for 3 weeks last year. Her bill included charges for equipment that was never used on her. When I questioned it, they said it was standard, but I worked in healthcare for 10 years. I know when something isn't right. "So you became a private investigator?" "I was already studying criminal justice at night. After what happened with my mother, I decided to get my PI license and look into it myself." Judge Wilson noticed photos on her desk of an older woman who looked like Grace. Her mother, he guessed. "The hospital administration won't listen to me," Grace continued. "They say I don't have enough proof. That's why I've been watching the loading dock. I believe supplies are being taken out through there." Judge Wilson felt a twist of guilt. His fine had made her work harder. "And you've seen something?" "Patterns," Grace said. "The same van comes every Tuesday and Friday night. The same 2 security guards are always on duty those nights, and the inventory system shows more missing items on Wednesday and Saturday mornings. Have you taken this to the police?" Grace shook her head. "Not yet. I need solid evidence. Pictures, names, times. And I need to know who's in charge. This isn't just a few guards taking things. Someone with access to the system is involved." Judge Wilson stood up and walked to the window. From here he could see the hospital in the distance. How many patients had been charged for supplies they never received? How many couldn't pay their bills because of it? "Ms. Brown, I owe you an apology," he said finally. "I made a judgment, without having all the facts." Grace looked surprised. "You were doing your job, Your Honor. I broke the parking rules." "Perhaps, but justice should be about more than just following rules." He turned back to her. "What's your next step?" "I'll keep watching," she said simply, "until I have enough evidence." Judge Wilson thought for a moment. "There might be a better way. A way that doesn't involve more parking tickets." "I'm listening." "I play golf with the hospital board chairman, Peter Miller. He's an honest man. If what you're saying is true, he would want to know." Grace looked uncertain. "If you tell him, whoever is behind this might find out I'm watching. I won't mention you or your investigation. I'll simply suggest he look into inventory discrepancies. It might put pressure on whoever is doing this." As he left Grace's office, Judge Wilson felt troubled. For 20 years he had believed justice was black and white. You either followed the law or you didn't. But Grace's story showed him the gray areas he'd been missing. The next day, on the golf course, he carefully brought up the subject with Peter Miller. "Peter, have you noticed any issues with supplies at Memorial lately?" The chairman looked surprised. "Funny you should ask. We've had some inventory problems." "Why do you ask?" "I heard something in court yesterday. Someone mentioned being charged for supplies they didn't receive." Peter frowned. "That shouldn't happen. I'll look into it." 2 days later, Judge Wilson received a call from Peter. "Edward, I checked those inventory records like you suggested. Something's definitely wrong. Items are missing but still being billed to patients. I've called for a full audit." Judge Wilson felt a mix of relief and worry. If Grace was right, whoever was behind the thefts would now know someone was looking into it. Would they be more careful or more dangerous? That evening he drove past the hospital again. He spotted Grace's car across from the loading dock. She was still watching, still waiting for evidence. He parked nearby and walked over to her window. "Ms. Brown," he said when she rolled down her window, "I think we need to talk." The end, part 3. Grace moved to the passenger seat so Judge Wilson could sit in her car. The evening was getting cold, and rain tapped gently on the roof. "What are you doing here?" Grace asked, surprised to see the judge. "I spoke with Peter Miller, the hospital board chairman," he admitted. "I didn't mention you, but I suggested he look into the missing supplies." Grace's eyes widened. "What did he say?" "He's ordered a full audit." He seemed genuinely concerned. Grace looked back at the hospital loading dock. "That changes things. If they're doing an audit, whoever is stealing will know they're being watched." "Is that bad?" "It could be," she said. "They might stop for now, or they might try to cover their tracks. Either way, it will be harder to catch them." Judge Wilson hadn't considered this. He had tried to help, but maybe he had made things worse. "I'm sorry. I thought it would help." "It's fine," Grace said, though her voice was tight. "I'll just have to adjust my approach." They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the hospital. A few nurses walked out, heading to their cars after the evening shift. "How did you become a judge?" Grace asked suddenly. The question surprised him. Few people asked about his life. "I was a lawyer for 15 years, mostly small cases, helping regular people. When the position opened up, I applied. I wanted to make sure everyone got a fair hearing, not just those who could afford expensive lawyers." "Do you feel you've done that? Given everyone a fair hearing?" The question stung, but Judge Wilson knew he deserved it. "I tried to, but I'm starting to see I've missed things. Important things." Grace nodded, still watching the hospital. Then she sat up straighter. "There's the van, the white one. It always comes on Tuesday and Friday nights." Judge Wilson looked where she was pointing. A plain white van with no markings was backing up to the loading dock. "Do you have a camera?" he asked. She handed him a small camera with a long lens. "It has night vision. Can you take photos while I write down the time and what they're loading?" For the next 30 minutes, they worked together. Judge Wilson took photos as men loaded boxes into the van. Grace wrote detailed notes about each person, what they carried, and the times. "That's Dr. Lewis," Judge Wilson said suddenly, recognizing one of the men. "He's the head of surgery." "Are you sure?" "Positive. I ruled on his divorce last year." Grace wrote this down. A doctor being involved explains a lot. He would have access to order supplies and change records. As they watched, a security guard approached the van. For a moment, Judge Wilson thought they were going to be caught, but then the guard helped load a large box. "He's in on it too," Grace whispered. Judge Wilson felt anger rising. These people were trusted with patients' lives, yet they were stealing from the very people they should be helping. Suddenly, a car pulled up next to the van. A man got out, tall, well-dressed. Even from a distance, Judge Wilson recognized him. "That's Alan Parker, the hospital administrator," he said, his voice tight. "I've known him for years." Grace quickly took photos. So the corruption goes all the way to the top. They watched as Parker spoke with the others, then handed something to the van driver. Money, most likely. Just as the meeting was breaking up, Grace's phone rang loudly in the quiet car. She quickly silenced it, but it was too late. The men at the loading dock looked in their direction. "They've seen us," Judge Wilson said. "We need to go." Grace started the car. "We have enough evidence for tonight." As they pulled away, Judge Wilson saw Parker speaking into a phone, looking in their direction. "Will you be safe?" he asked Grace. "They might have recognized your car." "I'll be fine. I'll change my routine, use different cars." Judge Wilson wasn't convinced. "These people are stealing thousands of pounds of medical supplies. That's serious crime. They won't want to be caught." Grace drove to a quiet street and parked. "Judge Wilson, why are you helping me? You could get in trouble for getting involved in an investigation." He thought about it. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because I misjudged you, I want to make that right. Grace studied him for a moment. I have most of what I need. Tomorrow I'll take everything to Detective James at the police station. He's trustworthy. Let me know what happens, Judge Wilson said as he got out of her car. And be careful. The next morning, Judge Wilson received a troubling call from Peter Miller. Edward, something strange has happened. The hospital administrator, Alan Parker, has suddenly taken emergency leave, and all the audit files I requested have been deleted from our system. Judge Wilson felt a chill. That's very concerning, Peter. There's more, Miller said, his voice dropping. The private investigator who was looking into this, a woman named Grace Brown, was attacked last night outside her office. The end, Part 4. Judge Wilson rushed to the hospital, his heart pounding. The emergency room was busy with nurses moving quickly between beds. He spotted Grace in a corner bed, a doctor checking her head. Ms. Brown, he said, approaching carefully. I just heard what happened. Grace looked up. Her left eye was swollen and a bandage covered her right temple. Despite her injuries, her eyes were clear and focused. Judge Wilson, she nodded slightly, wincing at the movement. I didn't expect to see you here. The doctor finished his examination. You're lucky, Ms. Brown. The cut isn't deep, and there's no sign of concussion. But I'd like to keep you for a few hours just to be sure. After the doctor left, Judge Wilson moved closer. What happened? I was getting into my car after leaving my office, Grace explained. Someone hit me from behind. I fell and hit my head, on the pavement. When I turned over, a man in a mask told me to stop asking questions about the hospital. Did you see his face? No. He wore a ski mask, but he was tall and strong. She touched her swollen eye carefully. When I tried to get up, he kicked me once and ran away. A neighbor heard the noise and came out. The man drove away in a dark car. Judge Wilson felt a wave of guilt. This is because of what we saw last night. They're trying to scare you off. It won't work, Grace said firmly. In fact, it tells us we're on the right track. They wouldn't attack me if we weren't close to the truth. A nurse approached with medication. Judge Wilson stepped back, thinking hard. This had gone beyond missing supplies. Grace could have been seriously hurt or worse. When the nurse left, he asked, Did you get to speak with Detective James? No, I was going to see him this morning. She pointed to her bag in the corner. All the evidence is in there, the photos, my notes, everything. Judge Wilson looked at the clock. It was nearly noon. I'll take it to him. You need to rest. Grace hesitated. This is my case. And you'll get full credit, he assured her. But you're in no condition to go to the police station right now. After a moment, Grace nodded. She told him where to find Detective James and what to tell him. Judge Wilson took her bag and promised to keep her updated. At the police station, Detective James listened carefully as Judge Wilson explained the situation. He spread out Grace's evidence on his desk, photos, notes, times, and names. This is serious, Detective James said, examining a photo of the hospital administrator with the van. Medical supply theft is becoming a big problem nationally. The supplies are sold on the black market for huge profits. What happens now? Judge Wilson asked. We'll need statements from both you and Ms. Brown. Then we'll get a warrant to check the hospital records and search Parker's home and office. The detective gathered the evidence. The attack on Ms. Brown changes things. We'll move quickly. Judge Wilson felt relief wash over him. The case was in the right hands now. He gave his statement, describing everything he had seen at the loading. Doc, as he was leaving, Detective James said, It's unusual for a judge to get involved in an investigation like this. I know, Judge Wilson admitted. But sometimes doing the right thing means stepping outside our normal roles. The detective nodded. Ms. Brown is lucky to have your help. Over the next few days, Judge Wilson kept in regular contact with Grace. She had been released from the hospital but was staying with a friend for safety. The police investigation was moving forward with several hospital employees being questioned. A week later, while Judge Wilson was in his chambers reviewing cases, there was a knock at his door. It was Detective James. We've made arrests, he announced. Alan Parker, Dr. Lewis, 2 security guards, and the van driver. They were selling the supplies to private clinics in Eastern Europe. We found records of transactions worth over £1 million. What about the attack on Ms. Brown? One of the security guards confessed. Parker ordered it to scare her off. We've added assault charges. Judge Wilson felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness. People entrusted with caring for the sick had betrayed that trust for money. That evening he visited Grace at her office. She was back at work, though her eye was still bruised. "Detective James told me about the arrests," she said as he entered. "It's over." "Thanks to you," Judge Wilson said. "Your persistence broke this case." Grace smiled slightly. "Not just me. Without your help, I might still be collecting evidence and parking tickets." Judge Wilson laughed, then grew serious. "I've been thinking about what you said, about justice being more than following rules. You were right." "What will happen to them?" Grace asked. "They'll face multiple charges: theft, conspiracy, assault, fraud. And they'll appear in my courtroom for their first hearing." Grace looked surprised. "Is that allowed, given your involvement?" "Normally no, but I've spoken with the chief judge. Given the circumstances, he's allowing it." Judge Wilson paused. "There's something else. The hospital board wants to meet with you." The end, part 5. 3 weeks later, Judge Wilson sat behind the bench in courtroom 3. The room was packed with people and reporters. Today was the preliminary hearing for Alan Parker and his accomplices. 5 men in suits sat at the defense table with their lawyers. Alan Parker, once respected as the hospital administrator, now looked tired and small. Dr. Lewis kept his eyes down, avoiding the stares of former colleagues. Grace sat in the front row. Her bruises had healed, but Judge Wilson knew the case had changed her. It had changed him too. "All rise," called the court officer. Judge Wilson began the hearing. The charges were read: grand theft, conspiracy, fraud, and assault. The evidence was strong. Detective James had found bank accounts with large deposits matching the dates of the thefts. They had recovered medical supplies in a warehouse ready to be shipped overseas. When it was time for the defendants to speak, Alan Parker stood. "Your Honor, we plead not guilty." Judge Wilson wasn't surprised. Few people admitted guilt at first hearings. "The evidence against you is substantial, Mr. Parker," Judge Wilson said. "This court takes these charges very seriously. Not only did you steal from the hospital, but you charged patients for supplies they never received. People trusted you with their health and safety." Parker's lawyer tried to interrupt, but Judge Wilson continued. "And when someone asked questions, you responded with violence." He looked at Grace briefly. "This case will proceed to trial. Bail is set at $100,000 each." As the defendants were led away, Judge Wilson saw Grace slip out of the courtroom. He finished his remaining cases quickly, then went to find her. She was standing outside the courthouse looking up at the clear blue sky. "Ms. Brown," he called. "Are you all right?" Grace turned. "Yes. It's just strange to see it ending." "It's not really ending," Judge Wilson said. "It's changing into something else." "What do you mean?" "Well, there's the trial. That will take months. And then there's your new job." Grace smiled slightly. "I start next week as the hospital's new patient advocate. I still can't believe they created the position for me." After the arrests, the hospital board had been desperate to rebuild trust. Creating a patient advocate role was part of their plan. When Peter Miller offered the job to Grace, she had been surprised, but pleased. "You're perfect for it," Judge Wilson said. "You stood up for patients when no one else would." They walked together down the courthouse steps. The spring sun was warm on their faces. "Will you miss being a private investigator?" he asked. "Sometimes, maybe. But this new role means I can help more people." She paused. "What about you? Will you go back to being the same judge as before?" Judge Wilson thought about this. The past month had forced him to question how he saw justice. "No," he said finally. "I can't go back. I see things differently now." "How so?" "I used to think justice was about applying the law equally to everyone. But that's not enough. True justice means looking deeper, understanding the full story. Sometimes the person breaking a small rule is trying to fix a bigger wrong. They reached the bottom of the steps. Grace turned to face him. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "I fined you $300 and nearly ruined your investigation." Grace laughed. "Yes, you did. But then you listened, you believed me, and you helped me when it mattered most." Judge Wilson felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sun. In his 20 years on the bench, he had handled thousands of cases, but this was the first time he had truly stepped into someone else's shoes. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out an official-looking document. "This is a court order clearing all your parking violations and refunding your fine." Grace took the paper with surprise. "You didn't have to do that. It's only fair. You were working to stop a crime." As they parted ways, Judge Wilson asked, "Will I see you at the trial?" "Every day," Grace promised. "And I expect a fair hearing." "Always," he said. "But now I understand that fairness isn't always what it seems on the surface." The next week, Judge Wilson watched from his office window as Grace walked into the hospital for her first day as patient advocate. He thought about how appearances could be deceiving. A parking violation could hide a deeper purpose. A hospital administrator could be a criminal, and a judge who thought he understood justice could still have much to learn. On his desk was a new business card. "Grace Brown, patient advocate," it read. Next to it was a small note. "Justice sometimes wears a parking ticket. Thank you for seeing beyond it." Judge Wilson smiled and turned back to his work, seeing each case with new eyes. The end.